Hi, Toddy. This is the response to your scripture, to the special offer there. So this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 7. So I won't necessarily read the whole thing because you can read it on here and you've obviously got it in the scriptures. But one of the key things, two big things about this is, one is to look at what the city of Corinth in Greece was like, the Corinthians as a people, because that's the context. He's writing to them, and he knows these folks. He lived there for a time. And the second thing is to take the whole scripture kind of together, and so we're going to do that here. So sometimes I'll kind of jump ahead and go, okay, this is what it's going to say later. The city of Corinth was a port city that was extremely important, and like a lot of port cities, it offered a lot of things. Corinth was known for its prostitutes. They had a parade, actually, a festival and parade every year that was a parade of the prostitutes. It was called the Aphrodisia, which is where we get the term aphrodisiac. It's a reference to the goddess Aphrodite. You can take a look at this and learn more about it and everything. And there's some footnotes, by the way, at the bottom. If you go to this site, the Catholic Bishop site, look up 1 Corinthians 7. You can read the footnotes, and I've learned a lot from those. But I like to just start with just reading it. Anyway, the people there were kind of obsessed with sex. And for Paul to move there, it was a little bit like somebody from Iowa or some farm in Mexico just moving to San Francisco. It was a wild place. San Francisco, of course, is a port town, like Corinth was. It was a very important one. And so it was a very hard adjustment. And the people there, when they came to faith, because they had lived with so many awful problems and had done things that they were ashamed of, they decided that maybe they didn't want to do those things anymore. And they took it so far that they didn't even want to get married. Now that's some of them, and this is what we think some of this is. But so when Paul writes in this particular way it's written here, it says, now in regard to the matters about which you wrote, and then it puts quotes, it's likely that we think that when they wrote to him and they said, this is how we feel, we don't want to have sex, we don't even want to get married, we just want to live completely ready for the Lord to come back. And Christians at this time had no idea that the world would go on like it's gone on for almost 2,000 years. They thought Jesus was coming back really soon. And it took quite a few years before they began to realize that God's plan was something that was longer term, and that the world wasn't going to end that quickly. So when they say this, they're saying, this is, tell us about this, because this is what we think, that it's not good to get married, basically, and things. So Paul says, well, in regard to this, look, because of cases of immorality, every man should have his own wife and every woman her own husband. In other words, they may have been trying to do something that they just couldn't do. And there are some people that want to be so good and so holy, but they want to do it in a way that God doesn't necessarily mean for them to do. And when they can't do it, sometimes they give up. Sometimes they fail. Sometimes they even turn against God because they say, I tried so hard and it didn't work, and so now I'm just going to forget about you completely. So he's just saying, it's better for you to, and you'll see this later, it's better just to go live a nice life, be married, have your husband and wife, and let it be that way. Now, people in Corinth, they shared each other's husbands and wives and everything. So when he says have his own wife and every woman her own husband, it means it's just the two, just the one man, the one woman, that's it. Now, verse 3, the husband should fulfill his duty towards his wife, and likewise the wife toward her husband. This gets some people rather upset. Now, duty in the sense of doing all the things that a husband should do for his wife, cleaning around and, picking up his stuff and making a living and all that kind of stuff, and likewise the wife toward her husband, doing, and in different marriages those roles are a little bit different. In some The husband works, the wife stays at home and keeps house and everything else. It's been that way in a lot of places and times. A lot of the time both work. And if that's the case, then they divide the duties up however they want to do it. For my wife Carol and for me, one of the things we worked out early, and this was kind of my idea, but she was fine with it, was that she would take care of all the money. So I don't write checks, I don't pay the bills, I don't have to do anything. All I have to do is work, and then she takes care of how it all goes. She manages the household. As they said in ancient Egypt, she is the queen of the house. And that's her domain, and mine is to work. And then we share things, when we have the children at home, we share parenting. And there's a lot of things we both do. We both have to clean to some degree. And I certainly know how to do laundry, and I can do dishes when I need to. Sorry, that was kind of a digression, wasn't it? But in this, because of the overall thing here, what it's saying is that when a couple gets married, that they should have sex. I'm just being blunt here. That the husband has a duty to his wife to treat her as a woman, to respect her as a woman, and to please her in that way. And the wife has a duty to that toward her husband. But it has to be mutual. It can't be a one-sided thing. So some people take this and they ignore the part about the husband's duty and just look at the wife's duty, and that doesn't cut it. It's got to be both. So that's terribly important. Okay. A wife, this is another thing that we talked about a little bit. A wife does not have authority over her own body, but rather her husband. And similarly, a husband does not have authority over his own body, but rather his wife. So the idea is that when it says in the scripture that the two shall become one, it's a mutual giving to each other. And you'll notice that everything in this is even all the way down. It's not, oh, the wife has to do whatever the husband says. No, and it doesn't say that about either one. But it's mutual. It says the wife doesn't have this and the husband doesn't have that. They have to give to each other. Okay? But he's really dealing here with whether or not married couples, people should get married, and whether the married couples should then live with vows of chastity so that they don't have sex, or should married couples have sex. It might seem silly, but people were really trying to be very good, and they thought that was more pure. Two things I should tell you about. There was a movement called the Gnostic movement, which I think I talked about in some of the classes. And they felt that the body was bad and only spiritual things were good. So their goal was to enjoy life and everything and enjoy all the stuff, and then starve themselves at the end and completely give up food and everything and just starve themselves to death at the end of their life. It was very strange. But that was the way they were. So Paul speaks against that, really. The other thing that's an interesting story is Thérèse of Lisieux, the great French saint, Santa Teresita. Her parents, when they got married, they were like, they didn't read this apparently. When they got married, they had decided to live as brother and sister and not have children, not have sex. And so the story goes that her father went to confession. We don't know what he confessed, but we know that the priest told him, don't do that. Just go have a normal marriage and have children. And so they did. They had 5 children, and all their children were holy. And of course, their youngest, Santa Teresita, became a great saint and a doctor of the church. So if they had not done that, they should have. I'm sure the priest probably told them about this very scripture, because this is the scripture that priest was thinking of for sure. So anyway, it's a big deal. Let's see. Here we go. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent for a time, to be free for prayer. So why would this matter for prayer? And a priest once told me in confession that sensuality or sex blinds the spiritual senses. That when a woman is thinking too much about guys, she's probably thinking less about God. When a man is thinking too much about women, he's probably not thinking about God. It's very hard to pray when we're oriented toward sexual pleasure or dating or whatever. we're not going to get too carried away on this and start, really getting guilty or weird. It's just to take it kind of relaxed. But he says, so by mutual consent for a time to be free for prayer. And the idea is that sometimes they would abstain from sex so that they could just focus on their relationship with God, really so they could kind of go on retreat. And then at some point, they've had that time, and then they go, okay, but we're married. And as it says, we have a duty to each other, and this is part of that. We are fulfilling part of God's plan by returning to each other. The other thing about this I think is interesting is, he says, then return to one another so that Satan may not tempt you through your lack of self-control. Now this could be taken a couple of ways. One of them is that they could be tempted to get involved with somebody else, which would blow the whole point of, separating from each other for prayer. But sometimes in a married couple, one is stronger about something than another. And the one might say, oh, we have to separate off so I can go off and pray. But the other one doesn't feel like praying and ends up doing something wrong because they weren't praying, but they weren't with their spouse either. And that could be a problem. Pardon me. But do not deprive each other except by mutual consent. Here's another interesting thing. In the church's teaching, we don't believe in birth control. What we use is, if we're going to regulate birth at all, we do it through what's called natural family planning, or by abstaining, not having sex for a time. And you can look this up, or you can ask about it, and I might be able to put something up for you. But this is what Carol and I used. And the idea was that she would track her cycles, and based on that and her temperature, it's called the symptothermal method. You can look that up. Anyway, by using that, we were able to space our children out a little bit. We had 6. Let's see, how'd that work? The first 3 were planned. 4th was planned, but we had twins, so we ended up with 2. That's not a fault of the method. And the 6th one was a surprise, and very different than the others in some ways. I bring this up because he says, you can separate by mutual consent for a time. So by using that, it makes it so that the couple is closer and then separates off for prayer, spends time with each other, spends time with God, and there's a beautiful thing to that. So anyway, this is probably more than you were bargaining for, I'm sorry, but you asked. And then he says, okay, let me get my mouse over here. Help, my mouse. This I say by way of concession, however, not as a command. Now, this is really powerful stuff. So a concession is, if you're making a deal with somebody, a concession is something that you give in on to make the deal happen. And I've worked in contract stuff and everything, and concessions is a big deal. What he's saying is, if you really, really want to do the separating thing for a time, if you want to abstain from sex so that you can pray, I'm saying that's fine. You can do that. I'm not telling you should do it. He says, however, not as a command. He says, I'm not telling you should do it. I'm not telling you shouldn't do it. I'm just saying, here's some things for you to think about. But I'm not setting any rules for you here, except that don't make it a permanent thing to be apart. Here's the interesting part in verse 7. He says, indeed, I wish everyone to be as I am. St. Paul never married. He practiced chastity, perpetual chastity. And some might think that the reason that the people of Corinth were considering separating and not having a regular marriage was because they looked at Paul, and Paul was the greatest Christian in the world as far as they knew. So they would look at that and say, well, Paul didn't get married, so we shouldn't get married. And he goes, no. That's just me, but you don't have to be just like me. Does that make sense? And I think that's beautiful, because not very many leaders will do that. Not very many leaders will say, don't be like me, do what you're supposed to do. But he says, but each has a particular gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. So he's saying, for me, this works. God calls me to be single and to be chaste. But maybe he's not calling you that way. Maybe he calls you to be married. If he does, be married and fully be married. Do it right. I just think Paul amazes me sometimes. Well, a lot of the time. He says, now to the unmarried and to widows, I say, it's a good thing for them to remain as they are, as I do. So if somebody, he's saying it's good for you to not get married, give yourself completely to God. But he says, but if that's too hard, get married. If you feel you should get married, it's better. It's better for you to get married than stay single and always be lusting after somebody. That's what he says. It's better to marry than be on fire. And he says, to the married, however, I give this instruction, not I, but the Lord. Now, before he said, hey, this is kind of my advice, but I'm not giving you a command here. But then at this point, he says, yes, this is from the Lord. A wife should not separate from her husband. And then it goes on from there about not divorcing and everything. So, kind of taking it as a whole, it was that some people in wanting to be holy felt that they should either not get married or get married, but in not having sex, that somehow that was more holy. And he says, no, have a normal marriage or don't. But be careful that you don't push yourself harder than you can go. There's people that try to be better in some way in their head. They're trying to do something that's more than what God's even calling them to do. And that doesn't always work. So anyway, let me know how I did. I hope you enjoyed that. It's a great scripture and one that I think of from time to time for a number of reasons. Obviously I'm married and that was the path that I chose. And sometimes I do think, if I had stayed single, I don't know that I would have ever been a priest, but maybe I could have done more. But Paul says, no, just be who you are. And if this is what you're called to, then that's your gift and you go do it. So I hope that's helpful.